The policeman stopped the car for a routine check, but the sight of the black girl in the back seat made him freeze. Subscribe and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. The evening sun hung low on the horizon, painting the sky in soft shades of orange and pink as Officer Jason Hall maneuvered his patrol car along the rural highway. The roads were quiet, save for the occasional hum of passing vehicles, and the rhythmic crackle of the police radio provided a faint backdrop to his thoughts. Jason had been an officer for over a decade, and though his career had its share of challenges, he had learned to approach every shift with a mixture of vigilance and calm resolve. The small southern town he served rarely saw major incidents, but Jason knew that trouble had a way of lurking in the most unsuspecting places. The day had been uneventful so far, with a few minor traffic violations and one call about a wandering dog that turned out to belong to a farmer down the road. Jason glanced at the clock on the dashboard. His shift was nearing its end, and the thought of a quiet evening at home gave him a small sense of relief. Yet, he remained alert. Experience had taught him that complacency was the enemy in this line of work. As he rounded a gentle bend, Jason noticed a white pickup truck approaching an intersection ahead. The truck slowed but didn't come to a complete stop at the red octagonal sign before rolling through. Jason sighed and flipped on his lights. It wasn't a major infraction, but rules were rules, and enforcing them was his duty. The truck pulled over to the side of the road without much hesitation. Jason parked a few feet behind it, stepping out of his cruiser and adjusting his utility belt as he approached the driver's side window. His boots crunched against the gravel shoulder, the sound faint against the backdrop of cicadas chirping in the fading daylight. The driver rolled down his window as Jason approached. He was a white man, perhaps in his early 40s, with a scruffy beard and a sharp, irritated expression. His knuckles were tight on the steering wheel, and he didn't immediately speak, instead fixing Jason with a challenging stare. Jason offered a professional but neutral greeting. "Good evening, sir. I pulled you over because you failed to come to a complete stop at the sign back there." The man exhaled sharply, leaning back in his seat as if the explanation was beneath him. "Oh, come on. I slowed down. Isn't that enough?" Jason's gaze flicked briefly to the back seat of the truck. There, sitting stiffly and clutching a well-worn stuffed animal, was a young black girl who couldn't have been more than 8 years old. Her dark, curly hair framed her face, and her wide, nervous eyes avoided Jason's. She held the stuffed animal tightly, her small hands trembling slightly as she pressed the toy against her chest. "Is that your daughter?" Jason asked, his tone calm but pointed. The man bristled, his irritation shifting into defensive anger. "Yeah, that's my daughter," he snapped. "We're on our way home, and this little stop is making us late." Jason's years on the force had honed his ability to read people, and something about the man's tone and body language raised a red flag. He turned his attention to the girl. She didn't look up, her gaze fixed firmly on the stuffed animal in her lap. "What's her name?" Jason asked. The question caught the man off guard. He hesitated for a fraction of a second before responding. "Her name's Chloe." The hesitation was brief, but Jason caught it. His gaze lingered on the girl for a moment longer. "Evening, Chloe," he said gently. "Are you doing okay back there?" The girl barely moved, her grip on the stuffed animal tightening. She nodded, a small, mechanical motion that didn't feel natural. The man interjected quickly. "She's fine. She's just tired. It's been a long day." Jason studied the man's face. There was a tension there, a subtle but undeniable unease. The girl's posture, stiff and defensive, told its own story. Something wasn't adding up, but there was no immediate evidence to justify detaining them further. Jason took a step back. "I'll need to see your license and registration," he said. The man reached for the glove compartment with deliberate motions, producing the requested documents and handing them over. Jason scanned them quickly. The name on the license was Jack Millard, and the truck was registered in his name. Everything appeared to be in order, but Jason's gut told him otherwise. Still, without clear evidence of wrongdoing, he had no legal basis to escalate the situation. After a moment, Jason handed the documents back. "All right, Mr. Millard, I'm letting you off with a warning this time. Make sure you come to a full stop next time." Jack snatched the documents from Jason's hand with a curt nod. Yeah. Thanks, officer." Jason stepped back as the truck started to pull away. His eyes lingered on the girl in the back seat. She glanced up briefly, their eyes meeting for a split second. In that moment, Jason saw something that sent a chill through him. A silent plea, a flicker of fear that no child should carry. As the truck disappeared into the fading light, Jason returned to his cruiser, his mind racing. He jotted down the truck's license plate in his notebook, unable to shake the unease settling over him. Something about the interaction didn't sit right, and he couldn't let it go. His training told him to trust his instincts, and his instincts were screaming that the little girl in that truck needed help. Jason sat behind the wheel of his cruiser, his hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and the sky was now a deep shade of blue, dotted with the first stars of the evening. The quiet hum of the police radio filled the cabin, but Jason's mind wasn't on the routine chatter. He couldn't stop thinking about the girl in the back seat of the white pickup truck, the way her small hands gripped the stuffed animal, the stiffness in her posture, and, most hauntingly, the fleeting fear in her eyes when their gazes met. He flipped open his notebook, staring at the license plate number he'd jotted down moments after the truck had pulled away. JTY 4372. His gut told him that letting the truck go had been a mistake, but protocol left him with little choice. Now, with nothing more than a hunch, Jason debated his next move. The town was small, and his shift was almost over, but he knew he couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling in his chest. Picking up his radio, Jason called dispatch. "This is Officer Hall requesting a check on a license plate. JTY 4372, white pickup truck. Owner listed as Jack Millard." There was a pause on the other end, followed by the familiar voice of the dispatcher. "Copy that, Officer Hall. Stand by." Jason drummed his fingers against the steering wheel, his eyes scanning the empty road ahead. Minutes ticked by, the stillness of the evening amplifying the weight of his thoughts. When the dispatcher's voice crackled back through the radio, it carried an edge of urgency. "Officer Hall, we've got a match on a possible missing child case. A black female, approximately 8 years old, reported missing 3 days ago out of Wakefield, one state over. Name, Amara Jenkins. Description matches the girl you reported seeing. Sending over details now." Jason's breath hitched. His suspicions were confirmed, and the implications hit him like a freight train. The girl, Amara, wasn't Jack Millard's daughter. She was a missing child, likely abducted, and Jason had just let her and her captor drive away into the night. The dispatcher continued, her voice steady but firm. "Wakefield PD issued an Amber Alert when she was reported missing. Witnesses last saw her playing in her front yard. Parents said she disappeared within minutes. No leads on the suspect until now. Officer Hall, do you require backup?" Jason tightened his grip on the radio. "Not yet," he replied, his voice low but resolute. "I'm going to pursue." He flipped through the details coming through his cruiser's onboard computer. The Amber Alert included a photo of Amara, a bright-eyed little girl with a wide, toothy smile and curly hair. It was a stark contrast to the frightened, subdued child he'd seen in the truck. Her parents had provided a heart-wrenching statement, pleading for her safe return. Jason's heart clenched as he read it, anger simmering beneath the surface. Whoever Jack Millard was, he'd stolen this child from her family, and Jason wasn't going to let him slip away. He keyed up his radio again. "Dispatch, do we have any hits on traffic cameras or recent sightings of the vehicle?" "Negative, Officer Hall. The vehicle hasn't been flagged in our jurisdiction yet, but I'll notify neighboring counties." Jason nodded to himself, setting the car into motion. The roads were dark and sparsely populated, but Jason knew the area well. If Millard was trying to avoid detection, he'd likely take back roads to steer clear of main highways. Jason plotted a route in his head, thinking of likely escape paths that would lead out of town without drawing attention. As he drove, his mind raced through the encounter. Millard's aggressive demeanor, the way he'd deflected questions, the girl's silence. It all made sense now. Jason cursed himself under his breath for not acting sooner, but there was no time for regret. He had a chance to make this right, and he wasn't going to waste it. His radio crackled again. "Officer Hall, Wakefield PD is en route to assist. Estimated arrival in 30 minutes. "Understood," Jason replied. 30 minutes was too long. By then, Millard could be halfway to the state line or deeper into the woods. Jason pressed the accelerator, his cruiser responding with a low growl as it picked up speed. 10 minutes later, Jason spotted tire tracks veering off onto a gravel road. The tracks were fresh, the dust still settling. He slowed his cruiser, shining his headlights down the narrow path. It led toward the woods, dense, dark, and sprawling. Jason's instincts screamed that Millard had taken this route to avoid detection. The woods would offer cover, but they were also a labyrinth. If Millard disappeared into them, finding him would be like searching for a needle in a haystack. Jason radioed dispatch again. "This is Officer Hall. I've located a possible lead. Fresh tire tracks heading into the woods near Old Mill Road. Requesting backup at this location." "Copy that, Officer Hall. Backup is on the way." Jason turned off his headlights, easing the cruiser down the gravel path as quietly as possible. The forest loomed around him, its shadows deep and foreboding. He parked the car at the edge of the trees and stepped out, his flashlight cutting a narrow beam through the darkness. The faint sound of voices reached his ears. Millard's low, angry tone and the soft, muffled whimper of a child. His pulse quickened. They were close. Jason moved carefully, his hand resting on the grip of his sidearm as he followed the voices. The gravel gave way to soft earth, and the forest grew darker with every step. Millard's voice became clearer, his words sharp and filled with frustration. "Shut up," Millard barked. "I said shut up." Jason's jaw clenched. He was close enough now to see the faint outline of the truck through the trees, its rear lights dimly glowing. Millard stood near the open passenger door, his figure silhouetted against the faint moonlight. Amara was beside him, her small frame trembling as he loomed over her. Jason took a deep breath, steadying himself. He'd caught up to them, but the danger was far from over. Jason's breath was steady as he crouched low behind a cluster of trees, the faint glow of the truck's taillights illuminating the dense forest. Millard stood near the open passenger door, his figure shadowed and imposing in the pale moonlight. Beside him, Amara's small frame was hunched, her arms wrapped protectively around her stuffed animal. Jason could see her shaken, even from a distance. Millard's voice broke the stillness of the forest. "Stop crying," he barked, his tone low and menacing. "You're making this harder for both of us." Jason's fingers flexed on the grip of his sidearm. He considered his options, weighing the risks of confronting Millard directly. The man was agitated, dangerous, and desperate. Any wrong move could escalate the situation, putting Amara in greater danger. Jason scanned the area, searching for cover that would allow him to get closer without being seen. As he took a step forward, the crunch of dry leaves under his boot betrayed his position. Millard's head snapped up, his eyes scanning the shadows. Jason froze, keeping his flashlight off and blending into the darkness. "Who's there?" Millard growled, his voice sharp with suspicion. He grabbed Amara by the arm, yanking her closer. The girl whimpered but didn't resist. "If you're out there, you better show yourself." Jason's heart pounded, but he forced himself to stay calm. He took a slow, deliberate breath before speaking, his voice firm and authoritative. "Jack Millard, this is Officer Jason Hall with the county police. Let the girl go and step away from the vehicle." Millard spun toward the sound, pulling Amara in front of him like a shield. His face was a mask of rage and desperation. "Stay back!" he shouted, his voice echoing through the trees. "You don't know what you're dealing with." Jason raised his hands slightly, showing he wasn't making any sudden moves. "It's over, Jack. Backup is on the way. There's nowhere to run. Let her go, and we can resolve this peacefully." Millard laughed bitterly, his grip tightening on Amara's arm. "You think I'm stupid? You think I don't know what happens to people like me in jail? No way. I'm not going down for this." Jason's eyes flicked to Amara, her tear-streaked face barely visible in the dim light. "She's just a kid, Jack. She doesn't deserve this. You don't want to hurt her." Millard's expression faltered for a moment, a flicker of doubt crossing his face. Jason seized the opportunity. "Let her go, and I'll make sure no one else gets hurt. You have a choice here." The hesitation was brief, but then Millard's resolve hardened. "No, I'm not going anywhere with you." He shoved Amara into the passenger seat and slammed the door, climbing into the driver's seat in one swift motion. The truck roared to life, its headlights cutting through the trees as Millard slammed on the gas. Jason sprang into action, sprinting back to his cruiser. The truck's tires kicked up dirt and leaves as it tore down the narrow path. Jason threw open the door of his car, turning on the engine and flipping the switch for the lights and sirens. The sound pierced the quiet night as he peeled out onto the gravel road, the glow of Millard's taillights guiding his pursuit. The chase was immediate and relentless. The gravel road twisted and turned through the forest, and Jason's cruiser bounced over the uneven terrain, the tires struggling for grip. Millard pushed the truck to its limits, the rear end fishtailing around corners as he tried to put distance between them. But Jason stayed close, his focus razor-sharp. Jason reached for his radio. "Dispatch, this is Officer Hall. Suspect is fleeing in a white pickup truck, heading south on Old Mill Road. I am in pursuit. Request immediate backup." The dispatcher's voice came through, steady and clear. "Copy that, Officer Hall. Backup is en route. ETA 5 minutes." Jason tightened his grip on the wheel, his eyes locked on the truck ahead. Millard veered off the gravel road onto a dirt path, the truck's headlights bouncing wildly as it barreled through the uneven terrain. Jason followed, his cruiser's suspension groaning under the strain. The forest grew denser, the trees closing in on either side of the path. Branches scraped against the sides of Jason's car, the sound sharp and grating. Millard's truck disappeared around a sharp bend, and for a moment Jason lost sight of him. He pressed the accelerator, rounding the corner just in time to see the truck skid to a stop in a small clearing. Millard jumped out, dragging Amara with him. Jason hit the brakes, the cruiser sliding to a halt a few yards away. He stepped out, drawing his weapon and training it on Millard. "Stop right there, Jack!" Jason shouted, his voice firm. "Let the girl go now!" Millard spun around, holding a knife in one hand and gripping Amara's arm with the other. "I'll do it!" he screamed, his eyes wild. "I'll do it if you don't back off!" Jason's mind raced. The knife was too close to Amara. Any sudden move could provoke Millard into following through on his threat. Jason lowered his weapon slightly, keeping his voice calm and steady. "You don't want to do this, Jack. Put the knife down, and we can end this right now." Millard shook his head violently, his grip on Amara tightening. "You think I care about ending this? You think I care about anything anymore?" Jason took a slow step forward, his movements deliberate. "I think you care more than you're letting on. Let her go, Jack. This doesn't have to end badly." For a moment, Millard seemed to waver, but then he yanked Amara closer, the blade pressing against her small arm. Jason's stomach churned, but he didn't let it show. He focused on the girl's face, on her wide, terrified eyes, and knew he had to act. In a sudden burst of movement, Jason lunged to the side, drawing Millard's attention. As the man turned his head, Jason threw a rock he'd picked up during his approach. It struck Millard's wrist, making him cry out and drop the knife. In the same motion, Jason surged forward, tackling Millard to the ground. Amara stumbled backward, falling onto the forest floor. Jason wrestled Millard, pinning him down as the man thrashed and shouted, "Get off me! You don't know what you're doing!" Jason ignored him, pulling out his cuffs and snapping them onto Millard's wrists. The man continued to struggle, but Jason's grip was unyielding. He hauled Millard to his feet, dragging him back toward the cruiser. Amara sat where she'd fallen, her stuffed animal clutched to her chest. Jason knelt beside her, his voice soft. "It's okay now. You're safe. He can't hurt you anymore." Tears streamed down her face as she nodded, her small body trembling. Jason helped her to her feet, his heart aching at the sight of her fear. As he secured Millard in the back of the cruiser and placed a blanket around Amara's shoulders, the sound of sirens in the distance signaled the arrival of backup. Jason exhaled, his shoulders relaxing for the first time that night. The chase was over, but Jason knew this was only the beginning of the road to justice. The cruiser's engine idled quietly in the clearing, its headlights casting stark beams through the dense trees. Jason stood by the open passenger door, his hand resting on Amara's shoulder as he tried to calm her trembling form. Millard sat in the back seat, his face twisted into a mix of anger and frustration, the handcuffs biting into his wrists. Jason had half a mind to start driving back to the station, but something gnawed at him, a faint noise in the woods behind them, like the rustling of leaves. Jason's hand instinctively moved toward his holster as he turned to scan the dark forest. Amara stiffened beside him, clutching her stuffed animal closer. "Stay here," Jason said softly, his voice calm but firm. "Lock the door and don't move." Amara nodded, her wide eyes filled with fear. Jason closed the door, ensuring it was secure before turning back toward the woods. The rustling grew louder, closer. He took out his flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness like a knife. Shadows shifted among the trees, the dense undergrowth making it hard to discern what or who was out there. Jason circled back to the trunk of his cruiser, retrieving a handheld radio and a tactical flashlight with a broader beam. "Dispatch, this is Officer Hall," he said, keeping his voice low. "I'm in the clearing off Old Mill Road. Backup is on site, but I'm investigating potential movement in the woods. Over." The dispatcher's voice came back promptly. "Copy that, Officer Hall. Units are en route to your location. Proceed with caution." Jason clicked off the radio and moved toward the tree line, his footsteps deliberate and quiet. The forest swallowed him in its vast, shadowy embrace, a thick canopy blotting out what little moonlight had illuminated the clearing. Every step was a calculated risk. The crunch of dry leaves underfoot could alert anyone or anything to his presence. The rustling grew more distinct, accompanied by the occasional snap of a twig. Jason's flashlight caught the faint outline of something, a figure darting between the trees. His pulse quickened, and he slowed his pace, crouching slightly to minimize his silhouette. "Stop right there," Jason called out, his voice firm and commanding. The figure froze for a split second before bolting deeper into the woods. Jason cursed under his breath and gave chase, weaving through the trees as branches clawed at his uniform. The pursuit was chaotic, the dense undergrowth making every step a challenge. Jason's flashlight swung wildly as he tried to keep the figure in sight. Whoever it was, they were fast and knew the terrain well, ducking and weaving through the trees with a practiced ease. Jason pushed himself harder, his breath coming in short, controlled bursts. Suddenly, the figure stumbled, tripping over a fallen branch. Jason seized the opportunity, closing the distance in a matter of seconds. He trained his flashlight on the figure, a man, his face obscured by a dark hood. The man scrambled to his feet, but Jason was faster, pinning him against a tree and securing his arms behind his back. "Who are you?" Jason demanded, his voice sharp. "What are you doing out here?" The man grunted, his face hidden in the shadows. "I don't know what you're talking about," he muttered, his tone defiant. Jason patted him down quickly, finding a hunting knife tucked into his belt. He tossed it aside, out of reach. "You've got two choices," Jason said coldly. "You tell me who you are and why you're out here, or I'll drag you back to the station and let the detectives figure it out." The man stayed silent, his breathing heavy. Jason tightened his grip on the man's arms, his patience thinning. "You were following us," he pressed. "Why?" A faint smirk played on the man's lips. "You think this ends here?" he said, his voice low and taunting. "You have no idea what you've stepped into." Jason ignored the comment, pulling out his cuffs and restraining the man's hands. "We'll see about that." He grabbed the radio clipped to his vest. "Officer Hall here. I've detained a second suspect in the woods. Male, mid-30s, armed with a knife. Request immediate transport." "Copy that, Officer Hall," came the dispatcher's reply. "Transport is en route. Hold your position." Jason started back toward the clearing, the man stumbling slightly as he dragged him along. The trek felt longer this time, the darkness pressing in around them. Every so often, the man muttered something under his breath. Taunts, cryptic warnings, threats, but Jason didn't respond. His focus was on getting back to Amara and ensuring her safety. When they reached the clearing, Jason was relieved to see the flashing lights of backup units illuminating the area. Two officers stepped out of their vehicles, their hands resting on their weapons as they approached. "Got him in the woods," Jason said, handing the suspect off to one of the officers. He was armed and moving toward the clearing. The officer nodded, securing the man in the back of a squad car. Jason turned his attention to Millard, who was watching the scene unfold from the back of Jason's cruiser. For the first time that night, a flicker of fear crossed Millard's face. Jason opened the passenger door and knelt beside Amara, who was still clutching her stuffed animal tightly. "It's okay now," he said softly. "We've got him." Amara nodded, her small frame trembling. Jason placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder before standing and addressing the other officers. "I'll stay with the girl. Take these two back to the station. I'll meet you there after I finish up here." The officers acknowledged his instructions, loading Millard and the second suspect into separate cars. As the vehicles pulled away, their red and blue lights fading into the distance, Jason felt a momentary sense of relief, but it was short-lived. The man's cryptic words echoed in his mind. "You think this ends here?" Jason glanced down at Amara. Her safety was his first priority, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the night's events were part of something much larger and far more dangerous than he'd anticipated. For now, though, he focused on the task at hand, getting her home. The drive back to the station was quiet, save for the low hum of the cruiser's engine and the occasional crackle of the radio. Jason glanced at Amara through the rearview mirror. She sat curled in the corner of the back seat, still clutching her stuffed animal. The moonlight streaming through the window illuminated her tear-streaked face, and Jason's chest tightened at the side. He wanted to reassure her, to say something that might ease her fear, but he knew that words could only do so much. Her world had been upended, and nothing he said would undo the trauma she'd endured. Ahead, the faint glow of the station's lights came into view, a stark contrast to the oppressive darkness of the forest they'd just left. Jason pulled into the lot, parking near the entrance. Two other squad cars were already there, their occupants busy escorting the suspects, Jack Millard and the hooded accomplice inside. Jason stepped out of the cruiser and opened the rear door, offering Amara a hand. "It's okay," he said gently. "You're safe now." Amara hesitated before sliding out of the car. Her stuffed animal dangled from one hand as she clung to Jason's arm with the other. He led her inside, where an officer guided her to a quiet room set up with blankets and snacks. A child psychologist from the department was already waiting, her demeanor calm and nurturing as she introduced herself to Amara. Jason lingered in the doorway, watching as the psychologist knelt beside Amara, speaking in a soft, soothing tone. Amara didn't respond at first, her eyes fixed on the stuffed animal in her lap, but eventually she nodded and whispered something in return. Jason exhaled, relieved that she was in good hands, and turned his attention to the suspects. In the interrogation room, Jack Millard sat slouched in a metal chair, his wrists cuffed to the table. His defiance had waned, replaced by a sullen, guarded expression. Across the table, a detective leaned forward, methodically questioning him about the events of the night. Millard responded in clipped, evasive answers, his gaze flickering to the two-way mirror on the wall. Jason stood behind the mirror, arms crossed as he watched the exchange. He wasn't surprised by Millard's resistance. Men like him thrived on control, and being cornered left them scrambling to regain it. But Jason wasn't here for the small talk. He wanted answers. The door to the observation room opened, and Detective Laura Hayes stepped inside. She was sharp-eyed and no-nonsense, her reputation as a relentless investigator well-earned. She handed Jason a folder containing the preliminary findings from Millard's vehicle. "You're going to want to see this," Hayes said, flipping open the folder. Inside were photographs of items recovered from the truck, forged documents, including birth certificates and custody papers, a notebook filled with coded entries that appeared to track transactions, and a set of burner phones. Jason's stomach turned as he scanned the photos. He was planning to move her, he said, his voice grim. Hayes nodded. And not just her. This ledger lists multiple names and dates. If it's what we think it is, Millard isn't working alone. This could be part of a larger operation. Jason's jaw tightened. The thought of Amara being just one of many children caught in this nightmare filled him with rage. What about the accomplice? He asked. Did he talk? Hayes shook her head. Not yet. He's playing the silent game, but we're working on it. Jason turned back to the mirror, his gaze hardening. We need to get Millard to talk. If this is a trafficking ring, he's a key piece. Hayes smirked faintly. That's the plan. Let's break him. Inside the interrogation room, the detective questioning Millard shifted tactics, laying out the evidence in front of him. The photos of the forged documents and the notebook were placed on the table, each one a damning piece of the puzzle. Millard's expression tightened, his jaw clenching as he stared at the images. You're looking at serious charges, Jack, the detective said, his tone firm but even. Kidnapping, forgery, conspiracy. And that's just the start. This ledger, it ties you to a whole network. You can either help us take them down or you can go down with them. Millard's lips pressed into a thin line. For a moment, it seemed as though he might crack, but then his defiance resurfaced. You've got nothing, he sneered. Those papers? They don't prove anything. You're grasping at straws. The detective leaned back in his chair, unfazed. You keep telling yourself that. But when this goes to court and you're looking at a life sentence, don't say we didn't give you a chance. Jason's radio crackled, pulling him away from the tense scene. It was a call from one of the officers processing the evidence. Officer Hall, we found a hidden compartment in the truck. You're going to want to see this. Jason hurried to the evidence room where the officer guided him to a table. On it lay the contents of the compartment. A bundle of passports, each bearing photos of different children with fabricated names and identities. Some of the faces were younger versions of children reported missing in recent years. Jason's stomach dropped as he thumbed through the stack. Each passport represented a stolen life, a family left in anguish. The scope of the operation was becoming horrifyingly clear. Get these to Hayes, Jason said, his voice tight. She'll want to use them in the interrogation. The officer nodded, gathering the items and heading toward the interrogation rooms. Jason stayed behind, his hands braced against the table as he stared down at the evidence. Anger and determination burned in his chest. He'd come too close to losing Amara tonight. He wasn't going to let these people destroy more lives. When Hayes returned to the observation room, she brought the passports with her, spreading them out on the table in front of Jason. We've got leverage now, she said. Millard might think he's untouchable, but this ties him directly to trafficking. Jason nodded, his jaw set. We need to push him harder. Hayes smiled faintly. Oh, don't worry, we will. As the night wore on, Jason couldn't help but glance at the room where Amara sat with the psychologist. She was safe now, but there were others who weren't, others who were still out there, waiting to be found. And Jason was determined to bring them home, no matter what it took. The fluorescent lights of the precinct cast a cold, clinical glow as Jason Hall leaned against the doorframe of a quiet room where Amara sat. The child psychologist, a kind woman named Dr. Lynn, was speaking to her in a soft, measured tone. Amara sat curled on a chair, her stuffed animal clutched tightly to her chest. The child's wide eyes darted between Dr. Lynn and the doorway where Jason stood, watching silently. He couldn't stop thinking about the evidence they'd uncovered. The forged documents, the passports, and the chilling ledger filled with names and dates painted a picture too grim to ignore. Amara's ordeal was only the tip of the iceberg, and Jason knew the web of deception stretched far beyond Millard and his accomplice. A faint knock on the door pulled Jason from his thoughts. He turned to see Detective Hayes standing behind him, her expression a mixture of exhaustion and determination. She motioned for him to step out into the hallway. "Her parents just arrived," Hayes said quietly, glancing back toward the room. "They're in the waiting area." Jason nodded. "Have you told them anything yet?" "Only that she's safe," Hayes replied. "They've been through hell, Jason. They've barely slept since she went missing." Jason exhaled deeply, running a hand over his face. "Let's take them to her." The walk to the waiting area felt longer than it should have. Jason had spent hours thinking about the moment Amara would be reunited with her family, but now that it was here, a strange sense of trepidation settled over him. He pushed the feeling aside as he rounded the corner and saw Amara's parents. Claire and David Jenkins sat side by side on a worn leather couch, their hands tightly clasped together. Claire's eyes were red and swollen, her tear-streaked face filled with a mixture of hope and fear. David sat stiffly, his jaw clenched and his expression grim, as though bracing himself for the worst. Jason approached slowly, clearing his throat to announce his presence. Claire looked up first, her breath hitching when she saw him. "Officer Hall?" she asked, her voice trembling. Is Amara okay?" Jason nodded, his tone firm but warm. "She's safe. She's in the next room with a psychologist. You can see her now." Claire let out a sob, covering her mouth with one hand as tears streamed down her face. David stood abruptly, his hand tightening on Claire's shoulder as though to ground her. "Thank you," David said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for bringing her back to us." Jason stepped aside, motioning for them to follow. He led them down the hallway to the room where Amara sat. As he opened the door, Claire rushed past him, her hands flying to her mouth as she saw her daughter. "Amara!" Claire cried, her voice breaking. Amara looked up, her eyes widening in recognition. "Mommy?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Claire fell to her knees, wrapping her arms around Amara and pulling her close. "Oh, my baby, my sweet girl, I've got you. You're safe now." David knelt beside them, his large hands gently cradling Amara's shoulders as tears slipped down his cheeks. "We've been looking everywhere for you, sweetheart," he said softly. "We're never letting you go again." Jason stood in the doorway, his chest tightening as he watched the reunion. He'd seen his fair share of heartbreak on the job, but moments like this reminded him why he did what he did. Amara's muffled sobs and her parents' whispered reassurances filled the room, their voices a symphony of relief and love. After a while, Claire turned to Jason, still holding Amara tightly. "How can we ever thank you?" she asked, her voice choked with emotion. "You saved our little girl." Jason shook his head. "You don't need to thank me," he said softly. "Just take care of her. That's all that matters." The tender moment was interrupted by the shrill buzz of a phone. Jason stepped out into the hallway to take the call, leaving the family to their reunion. It was Hayes. "We've got a problem," she said without preamble. "The media's picked up on the case and they're spinning it hard." Jason frowned. "Spinning it how?" "Millard's lawyer is already pushing the narrative that this was all a misunderstanding," Hayes explained. "They're claiming he was being harassed by law enforcement because of the racial dynamic, him being a white man with a black child." Jason's stomach churned. He'd expected some pushback, but this? It wasn't just an insult to him, it was a slap in the face to Amara and her family. What about the evidence? The forged documents, the passports? It doesn't matter to them, Hayes said, her frustration evident. They're leaning into the racial angle to distract from the facts. The story's already spreading on social media. Jason leaned against the wall, pinching the bridge of his nose. The last thing he wanted was for the case to turn into a media circus, but he also knew he couldn't ignore it. "What do we do?" he asked. "We keep doing our jobs," Hayes replied firmly. "The evidence speaks for itself. Let them talk. By the time we're done, Millard and his accomplice won't have a leg to stand on." Jason nodded, though the weight of the situation pressed heavily on him. He ended the call and returned to the waiting area, where Amara and her family were now seated together. The sight brought him a brief moment of peace, but the storm brewing outside the station was impossible to ignore. As he walked past the observation room, Jason caught a glimpse of Millard sitting in the interrogation chair. His smirk returned and his posture relaxed. The man was already playing the long game, banking on the public's willingness to believe his version of events. Jason's fists clenched at his sides, but he forced himself to keep moving. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Later that evening, as Jason prepared to head home, he paused by the evidence room. The passports and ledger were neatly arranged on the table, each item a stark reminder of the larger operation at play. Amara's rescue was a victory, but there were more children out there, children who hadn't been found yet. Jason made a silent vow as he stood there. He wouldn't stop until every one of them was brought home. No matter what the media said, no matter how hard Millard's defense fought, Jason was in this for the long haul. Justice for Amara was only the beginning. The precinct was buzzing with activity the next morning. Officers moved purposefully through the halls, conversations overlapping as updates were exchanged. The evidence collected from Millard's truck had ignited a firestorm of investigative work. Every piece, every forged document, every cryptic entry in the ledger was being dissected for clues. Jason Hall stood in the center of the chaos, his mind racing as he processed the scope of what they had uncovered. Detective Hayes approached him with a file in hand, her expression grim but focused. "Jason, we've got more," she said, gesturing for him to follow her into one of the conference rooms. Inside, a large whiteboard was covered with photographs, maps, and notes. In the center was a timeline, each date and location tied to a missing child case. Red strings connected them like a sinister web. Hayes spread the file open on the table. "This is bigger than we thought. The ledger isn't just a list of transactions, it's a roadmap. Names, dates, locations. Some of these kids disappeared years ago, and look at this." She pointed to a series of notes in the margins, written in a shorthand that had taken hours to decode. "It's not just local. This operation spans multiple states." Jason leaned over the table, his eyes scanning the documents. His jaw tightened as he processed the implications. "And Millard? Where does he fit in?" Hayes nodded toward a photo pinned to the board, a grainy image of Millard standing beside a man in a dark suit. "He's a middleman. The ledger makes it clear he's not the top of the chain, but he's connected to someone who is." Jason's stomach churned as he looked at the photo. "Who's the guy?" Hayes sighed. "Still working on that. The records we've pulled suggest he's using an alias. But if we can get Millard to talk, he might lead us to him." Jason straightened, his fists clenching at his sides. Millard's not going to talk willingly. He thinks he's untouchable. Hayes gave him a pointed look. Then we find a way to make him realize he's not. The next few hours were a whirlwind of strategy meetings and information gathering. Jason found himself poring over the ledger, his eyes scanning the coded entries for patterns. Each name represented a life disrupted, a family shattered. It was overwhelming, but Jason forced himself to stay focused. These weren't just names, they were children who needed justice. A breakthrough came when one of the tech specialists flagged a number from Millard's burner phones. It belonged to a motel on the outskirts of a neighboring state, a place known for its transient clientele. Jason immediately recognized the significance. "This could be where they're holding more kids," he said, his voice urgent. "We need to move now." Hayes agreed, and within the hour, a team was assembled. The plan was straightforward, a coordinated raid on the motel, with officers securing the perimeter while detectives conducted the search. Jason insisted on being part of the team. He couldn't stand the thought of sitting on the sidelines while there was a chance to save more children. The drive to the motel was tense. Jason sat in the lead vehicle, his hands gripping the dashboard as the radio buzzed with updates from the other units. The closer they got, the heavier the weight in his chest grew. He kept thinking about Amara, how close she'd come to disappearing forever, and prayed that this raid would prevent the same fate for others. As they pulled into the motel's gravel lot, the team sprang into action. Officers fanned out, their weapons drawn as they approached the rundown building. Jason and Hayes led the charge, their steps silent but deliberate as they moved toward the first door. "Police!" Hayes shouted, her voice cutting through the still night. "Open up!" There was a pause, then the sound of shuffling inside. Jason's heart pounded as he prepared for the worst. When the door finally creaked open, a man in his late 50s stood there, his face pale and his hands trembling. He looked past Jason and Hayes towards the swarm of officers descending on the motel. Inside the room, Jason's flashlight illuminated a scene that made his blood run cold. Two children, no older than 10, were huddled on a threadbare mattress, their eyes wide with fear. Their faces were gaunt, their clothes disheveled, but they were alive. "Get them out of here," Jason said, his voice tight with emotion. He knelt beside the children, his tone softening. "You're safe now. We're going to take care of you." Over the next hour, the raid uncovered more victims and additional evidence tying Millard's network to the trafficking ring. The scope of the operation was staggering. Hidden compartments in vehicles, false identities, and encrypted communications painted a picture of a highly organized criminal enterprise. For Jason, the night was both a triumph and a reminder of how much work remained. Back at the precinct, the rescued children were placed in protective custody while social workers and psychologists worked to reunite them with their families. Jason watched from a distance as the children began to open up, their fear gradually giving way to relief. It was a bittersweet moment. Each child saved was a victory, but the thought of those still out there weighed heavily on him. Hayes approached him, her expression tired but resolute. "We've got enough to press additional charges against Millard and his accomplice, and with the evidence we collected tonight, we're closer to identifying the people at the top." Jason nodded, his jaw set. "Closer isn't enough. We need to take them all down." Hayes placed a hand on his shoulder. "We will, but it's going to take time." Jason glanced back at the children, then at the board covered with names and photos. Time's not something they have. The next morning, Jason returned to the conference room, determined to keep the momentum going. He and Hayes worked tirelessly, connecting the dots and following leads. Each step forward was hard-won, but Jason's resolve never wavered. He thought of Amara and the moment she'd looked up at him in the forest, her eyes filled with fear and hope. That moment fueled him. As the day turned into evening, an officer entered the room with a message. "Detective Hayes, Officer Hall. Millard's asking to talk." Jason exchanged a look with Hayes. They both knew this could be the break they needed. "Let's see what he has to say," Hayes said, her tone steely. Jason followed her to the interrogation room where Millard sat with his usual defiance. But there was something different in his eyes, something that hinted at fear. Jason leaned against the wall, arms crossed, as Hayes took a seat across from Millard. "You wanted to talk?" she said, her voice calm but firm. Millard hesitated, then leaned forward slightly. "I want a deal." Jason's eyes narrowed. He didn't trust the man, but if Millard was willing to give up the names of those higher up in the operation, it could be the key to dismantling the entire network. Hayes exchanged a glance with Jason before turning back to Millard. "Start talking," she said. The battle wasn't over, but Jason knew they were finally gaining ground, and he wasn't going to stop until every child in that ledger was safe. The courtroom was silent, save for the soft shuffle of papers and the occasional murmurs from the gallery. Jason Hall sat in the back row, his arms crossed as he watched the proceedings unfold. The judge's gavel struck sharply, calling the court to order as the jury filed in, their faces solemn. Weeks of tireless investigation had led to this moment. Millard and his accomplice were on trial, their fates hanging in the balance as the prosecution presented the mountain of evidence against them. Jason's gaze shifted to the defendant's table. Millard sat with his usual smug expression, but his accomplice, Matthew Carson, was visibly shaken. The weight of the charges against them was evident. Kidnapping, child trafficking, conspiracy, the list was as long as it was damning. The prosecutor stood, addressing the jury with a quiet confidence that carried across the room. "The evidence you've seen leaves no doubt," she began, her voice steady but firm. "These men were part of a larger network that preyed on children and tore families apart. Today, we have the chance to deliver justice, not just for Amara Jenkins, but for every child who suffered because of their actions." Jason's chest tightened at the mention of Amara. He had spent countless hours working on this case, poring over every detail, every lead. He'd been there when Amara was rescued, when the motel raid uncovered more victims, and when the ledger revealed the horrifying scope of the operation. Each moment had brought him closer to this day, and now it was up to the jury to decide. The jury foreman rose, clearing his throat as he read the verdicts. In the case of Jack Millard and Matthew Carson, we find the defendants guilty on all counts. A collective sigh of relief rippled through the courtroom. Amara's parents, seated near the front, clutched each other tightly, tears streaming down their faces. Jason felt a weight lift from his shoulders. Justice had been served, but he knew the fight wasn't over. In the weeks following the trial, the precinct became a hive of activity. The evidence collected during the investigation had led to a series of coordinated raids across multiple states. Each operation brought more arrests and, most importantly, more rescued children. Jason watched with a mix of pride and determination as his team worked tirelessly to dismantle the network piece by piece. Late one afternoon, as Jason sat in his office reviewing reports, his phone buzzed. It was a number he didn't recognize, but something told him to answer. "Officer Hall?" a familiar voice asked. "Yes, this is Jason," he replied. "This is Claire Jenkins. I hope I'm not interrupting." Jason's lips curved into a small smile. "Not at all." "How's Amara?" "She's doing well," Claire said, her tone warm but emotional. "She's back in school, and we're starting therapy sessions. She talks about you sometimes. She calls you her hero." Jason's throat tightened. "She's the real hero," he said softly. "She's been through so much, and she's still standing." Claire hesitated for a moment before continuing. "We were wondering if you might come by for dinner. We'd love to thank you in person, and Amara would be thrilled to see you." Jason agreed, and that evening he drove to the Jenkins home. The modest house was warm and inviting, its porch light glowing softly in the evening twilight. Claire and David greeted him at the door, their smiles genuine as they welcomed him inside. Amara stood shyly behind them, clutching the same stuffed animal she had held during the ordeal. "Officer Hall," she exclaimed, her face lighting up as she ran to him. Jason crouched down, accepting her hug. "Hey, Amara, how are you?" "I'm good," she said, her voice bright. "I wanted to show you something." She led him to the living room where a small table was covered with drawings and school projects. One of the drawings caught his eye, a crayon depiction of a police officer standing next to a little girl holding a stuffed animal. Above the scene, in shaky letters, was written, "Thank you, Officer Hall." Jason felt his chest tighten as he looked at the drawing. "This is beautiful, Amara," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you." Amara beamed, then ran off to get something else to show him. Claire and David stood nearby, their expressions a mix of gratitude and admiration. "She doesn't let go of that stuffed animal," Claire said, her voice soft. "She says it reminds her of how brave she was." Jason nodded, his gaze following Amara as she darted back into the room, holding a small photo album. "She's stronger than she knows." Later that evening, as Jason drove home, he found himself reflecting on everything that had led to this moment. Amara's case had been a turning point, not just in his career, but in his understanding of why he did what he did. It wasn't about the arrests, the trials, or even the victories in court. It was about moments like tonight, seeing a family whole again, a child safe and smiling. When he pulled into his driveway, Jason sat in his car for a moment, staring out at the quiet street. The case wasn't fully over. The raids and investigations would continue, but he felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in weeks. As he stepped out of the car, his radio crackled to life. A call was coming in about a suspicious vehicle near the outskirts of town. Jason grabbed his gear, his movements instinctive and deliberate. The fight wasn't over, but Jason Hall was ready for whatever came next. And this time, he knew that every decision he made, every step he took, could mean the difference between hope and despair. He wasn't just a cop, he was a protector, and he wouldn't stop until every child was safe. If you liked this story, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss new videos. Share this video with your friends to let them know this incredible story, and check out our other videos. They will definitely keep you entertained.